This video will cover an overview of the human circulatory system at GCSE level. So in humans, we've got this double circulatory system, which contains a few key organs, right? We've got the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels. So today we're going to look at an overview about some of the structure of the heart and heart problems, what are the four components in the blood, and the three types of blood vessels. So let's start with the double circulatory system. So first, in the heart, you would have the deoxygenated blood that goes from the heart to the lungs. So, and when they're in the lungs, they get gas exchange and you get oxygenated blood. So then the lungs would actually move the blood back to the heart. Now this is called the pulmonary circuit. Pulmonary means the lungs, so it's a circuit between the heart and the lungs. And they go back to the heart first because the heart is able to generate enough pressure to push the blood for further distance. So the blood will enter the left-hand side of the heart, and from the left ventricle, it will push the blood out from the heart, and it will go to the organs to deliver the oxygen and also the other nutrients such as glucose and amino acids to the organs. And once it gets to the organs, they do substance exchange, and all of the useful stuff go to the organ cells, and all of the toxic chemicals or waste products goes back into the blood. So the carbon dioxide, for example, goes back to the blood. So then we got back to deoxygenated blood, and then at that point the organs will allow the blood to travel back to the heart, carrying those carbon dioxide and waste products, and then the same thing happens. So the reason why it's called a double circulatory system is because we've got the pulmonary circuit over here, and then we've got the systemic circuit here. So it's two separate cycles, two circuits, and the blood goes through the heart twice in one full cycle, hence the word double. So to summarize what the circulatory system is for, it's the idea of the heart pumping the blood in the blood vessels around the body in order to deliver the oxygen and the other things like glucose, but to also remove the carbon dioxide and waste products from the different organs. So we're going to look at three aspects here. So first we're going to look at the heart. So there are four parts of the heart, four key structures of the heart that I want to mention, which will be about the chambers and the different vessels that we find in them. So let's start with the two types of chambers. So the whole heart can be divided up to four chambers, two on the top and two on the bottom. So two on the top, we call them the atria. So we can have the left atrium and the right atrium. So that's where the blood would go when it first enters the heart. Then when the atria contract, they will then push the blood through the valves in between, and it will go into the ventricles. So again, we can have the right ventricle and the left ventricle. So the blood from the right atria goes down to the right ventricle, and the blood in the left atrium will go down to the left ventricles. So those are the bottom chambers. And then from the ventricles, when the ventricle contract, it will then push the blood out of the heart through the heart vessels to either the lungs in the pulmonary circuit from the right-hand side of the heart, or if it's from the left-hand side of the heart, it will then go to the rest of the body. So I mentioned earlier we've got something called the valves. Now valves are structures that can be found in different places. So we can find two sets of valves between the atria and the ventricles, and then we can also find valves between the ventricles and the heart vessels as well. So valves, the key thing is that they stop the backflow of blood. So the idea is that when let's say the atria contract to push the blood to the ventricles, when the ventricles contract, the blood will go upwards. It can either go through the vessels out of the heart, which is what it's intended to do, or sometimes it could go back to the atria, which is what you don't want. So the valves exist between the ventricle and the atria to stop the blood from going backwards, and it's held in place with our heart tendons. So sometimes later on I'll mention about the issues of heart problems. One of the problems is that when the valves are broken, then there will be backflow of blood. That means less blood and less oxygen and less glucose leave the heart and get transferred and delivered to the organs, which is a bad idea. So the valves are very, very important there as well. Now, the heart also had lots of different types of vessels, in which I'll mention a few now. So first of all, we've got one of the biggest veins in the body, which is the vena cava. So the vena cava delivers the deoxygenated blood from the rest of the body back into the right atrium into the heart. So that's the vena cava. Then it can go through the right atrium, right ventricle, and it leaves and goes to the lungs through the pulmonary artery. Now, the pulmonary artery is a unique one because it's an artery, but it delivers deoxygenated blood to the lungs in particular. So remember, A means away from the heart, so that's why it's an artery. Now, once it gets to the lungs, it will get oxygenated through gas exchange, so we can also, the blood then comes back into the heart through the pulmonary vein. Again, it's a unique one because veins usually carry deoxygenated blood, but this is a unique one where it carries oxygenated blood. So vein, think of in, means into the heart. So once the blood goes through the pulmonary vein into the left atrium, then it goes to the left ventricle, and it gets out to the rest of the body through the aorta. So it's one of the biggest arteries we have in the body, and it is able to withstand high blood pressure generated by the left ventricles. We've got another very specific vessel that we also need to know about, which is the coronary vessels. Now, we usually think about the coronary arteries because they are the ones that actually push all of the oxygen and glucose to deliver them to the heart muscles. Now, the heart muscles need the oxygen and glucose in order to do respiration, for energy, for heart contractions. So that's why the coronary vessels are very, very important. So a type of disease, which is called the coronary heart disease, is when these vessels get blocked. And if they get blocked, that means that the heart muscles are not getting the oxygen and glucose. That means they do less respiration, they have less energy, contraction of the heart muscles becomes harder. So therefore, we can get, it's more easy for someone to have a heart attack or have heart failure in that situation. So on that note, let's have a think about some of the heart issues that we need to think about when it comes to some of these particular structures. Now, first of all, I already mentioned about the coronary heart disease, which is the coronary vessels being blocked. So there are usually several risk factors, which are things like, not doing enough exercise or having a high fat or cholesterol diet or high blood pressure could increase the risk of someone developing coronary heart disease. But the thing is, there are some treatments available for it. So in terms of treatment, one thing to do is to insert a stent into the blocked vessel. So a stent is a metal mesh that flattens the fatty deposits. So you are restoring the blood flow, restoring the delivery of the oxygen and glucose. So that's an easy way to do it, and it's quite well practiced nowadays. Obviously, there are risks to the surgery, which is obviously infection and all of that. But generally speaking, stents are really, really common nowadays to treat coronary heart disease. Another thing that could also be done is to take statins. Now, statins are medicines or drugs that lower the blood cholesterol level. And we mentioned that one of the risk factors for coronary heart disease is high cholesterol diet, or someone who naturally produces a lot more cholesterol would also have a high risk of this. So therefore, taking statins would lower the concentration of cholesterol in the bloodstream, reducing the chance of the blockage happening. So both of these things are quite common treatments for coronary heart disease, or prevention in some sense. But make sure you know the difference between the two, because they both start with ST, so make sure you know which one's which. So some other common problems with the heart would also include a faulty pacemaker. So we have a group of tissue that is found on the top of the right atrium that actually controls the heart rate or the heartbeat. So our normal heart rate is about 70 beats per minute, but if the pacemaker is not working properly, then you can either have too high of a heart rate, too low of a heart rate, or we've got something called arrhythmia, which is the heart rate is not steady. So the one thing to do to deal with that is to put an artificial pacemaker that overrides the natural pacemaker. So that's how you can fix it. Another issue is a broken valve. So I mentioned that there are some valves found between the atria and the ventricles held together by tendons. But for example, high blood pressure could mean that those tendons break and the valves open the opposite way, which allows backflow of blood. So one way to deal with that is to do a valve replacement, which can be a biological valve or a mechanical valve. The types of questions you usually get is that they will give you information about the biological and mechanical valves and then ask you to evaluate the two. You will need to use some of your own knowledge about it as well, which are issues of blood clotting or rejection issues in terms of the immune system. So those are details that you need to work on when studying this topic. Sometimes it could be the entire heart is failing. It could be a widespread infection that affects the heart muscles, or it could be something else. But when the whole heart is not working, then you will need to have a replacement heart. So either you will start with an artificial heart, like a machine that pumps the blood around for you, until you can get a heart transplant that can be done properly. That would obviously restore the quality of life. So those are the 4 problems of the heart that you need to be aware of. So, a few things you need to know about the heart is the names of the 4 different chambers, which are the left and right atrium and the left and right ventricles. We got valves to stop the backflow of blood between the chambers. We can also have the different types of vessels connected to the heart that delivers the blood to different places. And specifically, you need to know about 4 potential issues of the heart, which in particular you will ask about the coronary heart disease, which links to non-communicable diseases like obesity and diet issues, and potentially about evaluating different types of replacement valves like biological and mechanical valves. So the next thing that we'll talk about is the blood. So there are 4 components of the blood that you need to be aware of. So the first component is probably one of the most famous one for the blood is the red blood cells. So red blood cells are biconcave disc shaped, and that is to increase their surface area to volume ratio, allowing faster diffusion of the oxygen into and out of the cells. And inside they don't have a nucleus, so that there's more space for hemoglobin, which is the protein that binds to the oxygen. The red blood cell makes up about 45% of the blood, so there's a lot of that, although it doesn't make up all of it. So another blood component would be the white blood cells. So there are many different types of white blood cells, but the idea is that the white blood cells kill pathogens for us. They kill any microorganisms that can make us ill, or sometimes even attack any cells they recognize as foreign cells, including healthy transplant organs, if a patient has received any of them. So that's why it's important to think about, in an organ transplant, how do you help a patient overcome this issue? But later on, when you learn about communicable diseases, you will learn about the human immune system, and you will learn more about the details of the functions of the white blood cells. But the white blood cells, actually, there are not that many in the bloodstream. It makes up less than 1% of our blood, but in the case of infection, the body will be able to produce a bit more. Which leads us on to platelets. So platelets are tiny, tiny fragments of cells that are able to clot the blood. In terms of exam questions, all they really ask is about the function of platelets, and that's it. They clot the blood and to obviously stop you from bleeding. Again, together with the white blood cell, they make up less than 1% of the blood, but they are super, super important. And lastly, we got our main component of the blood, which is the plasma. So plasma is actually the yellowish liquid that makes up the rest of the blood. About 55% of the blood is plasma. So it's the yellow liquid that carries any other dissolved substances in the blood. So key thing is they carry things like glucose, amino acids, hormones, vitamins, urea, which is a toxic chemical that we try to get rid of in our urine, and carbon dioxide as well is carried in the plasma. Key thing to remember is the oxygen is not carried in the plasma. Oxygen is carried in the red blood cells. So if the question asks you to name 2 dissolved substances carried by the plasma, you must not mention oxygen, because that's in the red blood cell. So those are the 4 components of the blood. So the last thing that we'll talk about in this video is about blood vessels. So there are 3 types of blood vessels. You will need to know their function and the adaptations for them, because a lot of times in exam questions, they'd like you to ask you to compare, so to look at the differences between these 3 different types. So make sure you know the difference between them. So as I mentioned, there are 3 types of blood vessels. We've got the artery, the capillary, and the vein. So you can see in these 3 pictures, they are showing us the cross-section of the vessels. Imagine that these vessels are coming out of the screen towards you, and that's what they look like. And with these 3 pictures, it makes it a bit easier for us to actually compare those 3 different types of vessels. So starting with the artery. So first of all, you can see that the wall of the artery is a lot thicker compared to the capillary and the vein. So you can mention one thing is that they've got a way thicker wall to start with. Now, not only is it physically thicker, it also has more muscles in it. So it is more muscular, and that is to help maintain some of the pressure in there. And also it's more elastic. So it's not obvious from this picture, but there are actually, these are actually the muscular tissues, so the red ones here, but actually mixed within it, there are also some elastic tissues to help it sort of maintain that high blood pressure as the blood is going through. Because without the muscular elastic walls, the blood pressure would cause the artery to burst quite easily. So it's really important we have thicker muscular and elastic walls. So another thing that we talk about the artery is that it's got a smaller lumen. So lumen refers to the space in between, within the vessel itself. So the space where the blood actually goes through. So you can even think about if this is the space where the blood is traveling through. The lumen is like the diameter of the surface here. So it's not very comparative in this picture, but the artery has a much smaller lumen than the vein, whereas the capillary actually, this is to make it a bit more obvious, but the capillary lumen will be even smaller. So it should look a little bit more like this. So moving on to the vein, what you tend to get asked is to compare the artery and the vein structure. So this makes it a little bit easier for us to kind of see how it works. So anything that is like the case in the artery then is not in the vein. So first of all, it's got a very thin wall. So it's got a thinner, notice the comparison there, the thinner wall. It's not muscular and it's not elastic. And also it's got a larger lumen. In fact, it's got the largest lumen among the three. So there is more space in between the insides of the wall, so more blood actually travels through. Another thing that is worth mentioning as well is that the veins have valves. And remember that I mentioned in the heart bit, the valves prevent the backflow of blood. So in the artery, because there's a high blood pressure, there's no need for valves because the blood is definitely going to be pushed in one single direction. But in the vein, the blood pressure is a lot lower, so there's a chance of the blood going backwards. So therefore, they would have valves to stop the backflow of blood. So finally, we get to the capillaries. Now, for the capillaries, you tend to just get asked to describe it instead of to compare it with the other vessels. But just so that you know as well, it's got the thinnest wall. So the wall is so thin that it's only one cell thick. So let's zoom into this picture to have a look. So you can see in this picture, actually, that is referring to the nucleus of the cells that line up the wall of the capillary. So it's only one cell thick here along all of the sides. Whereas in the arteries, you can see that it's made up of multiple layers of cells in between. So there's one layer of cell on the inside and then more to make up the muscular cells, or the muscular tissues there. So the capillary is meant to have the thinnest wall to allow fast substance exchange, because the point of the capillary is that they're inside the organs, so any oxygen and glucose can diffuse out of the capillary very quickly, and any waste products can diffuse into the capillary very, very quickly. So it's about having a shorter diffusion distance to facilitate the higher rate of diffusion. It's also got the smallest lumen among the three. So the idea is that in this lumen, you can maybe fit one red blood cell. So if that's a red blood cell with a biconcave shape, it can only fit one red blood cell through at any one point. So imagine all the red blood cells are lining up to enter the capillary. The idea is that each red blood cell is kind of also exposed and closest at one point will be close to the cells around it. So that means any of the oxygen inside the red blood cell can actually leave the red blood cell to enter the cells surrounding it. So it's got the smallest lumen to ensure all red blood cells can actually deliver the oxygen that it's meant to deliver. So be very careful when answering questions, because they can be asking you to compare, to give structural differences between arteries and veins, or they could be asking about blood composition differences. So remember, when you're answering the question, be very careful. If you're talking about blood composition, you need to be thinking about the concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide, glucose, and waste products between the artery and the vein. If it's structural, then you can mention any of the ones that we've just talked about as listed on the screen here. Final reminder is that artery means, artery for A means away from the heart. So that means that arteries are the blood vessels coming out of the heart to the rest of the body. Whereas the veins think of in, so that means they're going into the heart. So these are talking about delivering blood back into the heart from the rest of the body, let's say, for example. Whereas the capillaries are found inside the organs for substance exchange. So there you have it. This is the summary or an overview of the human circular system. So remember, it's a double circular system because of the two separate circuits between the heart and the lungs and the organs. And we've got the three major components, which is the heart, with the different chambers and the vessels. We've got the blood with the four components. Make sure you know their functions and adaptations. And the blood vessels, there are three types: artery, capillary, and veins. Make sure you know their structural differences and their functional differences. And you may be asked to mention the difference in terms of blood composition, which is how much oxygen or glucose or carbon dioxide the blood is carrying in the artery versus the vein, for example.